Note on defensive maneuvers outside of Delaware. States are evenly divided whether they apply heightened unicall Revlon scrutiny to defensive maneuvers or instead examine defensive maneuvers through the lens of business judgment rules so that plaintiff has the burden on issues of care and loyalty. State anti-takeover statutes discussed later play a very significant role in determining which of these two approaches is followed. In Barzuzza's article, 2009, courts and states with relatively strong anti-takeover statutes generally invoke the protective statutes to support their holding that the directors are not under enhanced duties when defending control. Thus, a majority of non-Delaware decisions address defensive maneuvers by according the director's actions the presumptions of the business judgment rule. That's probably one thing to note, is that all this heightened scrutiny stuff happens in Delaware, but not necessarily elsewhere. So, for example, in upholding the director's issuance of a poison pill to all shareholders except the hostile bidder, the Federal District Court applying New York law concluded that under New York law, a board's decision made on the basis of reasoned judgment and in the absence of self-dealing, conflict of interest, or bad faith would be valid. So that was the exclusionary self-tender offer, okay, in New York. Absent all those things. So, Dynamics Corp versus WHX. Connecticut further emphasized that the New York poison pill validation statute expressly authorized boards of directors to impose such conditions and limitations as the board believes in the corporation's and its shareholders' interests. Similarly, Seidman versus Central Bancorp Inc., Massachusetts, 2003, rejected engrafting Delaware's heightened review standards onto the Massachusetts other constituency statute that provided in part in determining what ... the director reasonably believed to be in the best interest of the corporation. The director may consider the interests of the corporation's employees, suppliers, creditors, and customers, the economy of the state, region, and nation, community and societal considerations, and long-term and short-term interests of the corporation and stockholders, including the possibility that these interests may be best served by the continued independence of the corporation. The court noted the legislative history on the provision reflected the desire to give protection to Massachusetts corporations from abusive takeovers, which challenge the long-term growth of the Commonwealth's economy, creation of new jobs, and long-term interests of shareholders. In responding to the arguments that this court should either import the proportionality doctrine in unicall or aspects of the Massachusetts common law relating to fiduciary duties of directors as a gloss on the protective reach of other constituency provision, the court is reminded of Justice Cardozo's eloquent comments on the role of the judge, particularly at the trial level. The judge, even when he is free, is still not wholly free. He is not to innovate at pleasure. He is not a knight-errant roaming at will in pursuit of his own ideal of beauty or goodness. He is to draw inspiration from consecrated principles. He is not to yield to spasmodic sentiment, to vogue and unregulated benevolence. He is to exercise discretion informed by tradition, methodized by analogy, disciplined by system, and subordinated to the primordial necessity of order in the social life. Cardozo, Nature of Judicial Process, 1921. That's the best quote I've ever read. Another fantastic Cardozo quote to go down in history. The Massachusetts and New York decisions are consistent with the approach embraced by the ALI, surprisingly. So section 602 here is impersonating ALI, but it's really not, because ALI is 6.02. So this has got to be either Massachusetts or New York. Action of directors that has the foreseeable effect of blocking unsolicited tender offers, i.e. defensive actions. A, B, and C I'm going to read. So A, the board of directors may take an action that has the foreseeable effect of blocking an unsolicited tender offer if the action is a reasonable response to the offer. B, in considering whether the action is reasonable response, the board, this is 1, may take into account all factors relevant to the interests of the corporation and the shareholders. The board may, in addition to the analysis above, have regard, or actually this is the ALI analysis, have regard for interests or groups other than shareholders with respect to the corporation has a legitimate concern, if to do so would not significantly disfavor the long-term interests of the shareholders. And C, a person who challenges an action of the board on the ground that it shifts. And by the way, that last remark there was like kind of other constituents, but really can't put them like incredibly higher, like above the shareholder interest, but they're probative. C, a person who challenges an action of the board on the ground that it fails to satisfy the standards of subsection A has the burden of proof that the board's action is an unreasonable response to the offer. Now, A, section 6.02, well, like this is lowercase a, section 6.02 reflects the view that judicial review of directors' blocking actions against unsolicited tender offers should not be based on the analysis of the director's motives. Such a review cannot effectively distinguish between cases in which directors favor themselves and cases in which directors properly look to the interests of the shareholders. Equally important, a motivational standard of review gives no guidance to directors, particularly disinterested directors, as to what constitutes appropriate behavior. Accordingly, 6.02 directs judicial inquiry initially to the question whether action taken by the directors has the foreseeable effect of blocking a tender offer and thereby precluding holders of voting equity securities from having the opportunity to accept the tender offer. If the director's action does not have that effect, then the court must further inquire whether the director's action was a reasonable response to the offer. There has been modest success in striking down anti-takeover measures even when the burden of proof is not placed on the directors to justify their defensive maneuvers or to prove they have acted as auctioneers. See First Union Court v. SunTrust Banks, Inc. And North Carolina Superior 2001 rejecting Unicall and Revlon, but nonetheless holding invalid a non-termination provision that was part of a bundle of deal protection items because its operation could coerce shareholders to support acquisitions supported by the board of directors. Query in assessing defensive maneuvers is the allocation of the burden of proof as significant as a substantive standard such as proportionality, coercion, and reasonableness of the director's behavior. Question mark. That is for me to ponder. I'm kind of going to skip the case that demonstrates protecting the deal. Omnicare case. I'm going to just kind of skip that for the main purpose that it's long and I'm going to record it later. I'm going to finish the case notes for this chapter. And I do believe they actually start on page 1131. Note on force the vote provisions. Delaware and the Model Act now authorize force the vote provisions. See Delaware General Corporate Law, Section 146, and NBCA, Section 8.26. The typical provision requires the target to seek approval of the acquisition, and prohibits the target board approving an acquisition by a third party until the original transaction has been voted on by the target shareholders. Why would the target board agree to such a provision? Does the authorization of the force the vote provision excuse directors of their fiduciary duty when they approve a force the vote provision? For example, must the provision itself include a fiduciary out? Now, we're going to go over state takeover statutes, which is going to be a little bit, it's made up of a couple parts too. So I'm going to read those parts. It's like interesting. They're called first generation statutes, second generation statutes, and third generation statutes. Those are the main parts, plus constituency statutes, plus Hill validation statutes. We're going to look at a case called Amada. We might even look at CTS Corp versus Dynamics in the second generation statutes. As part of the second generation statutes, subpart A, control share acquisition statutes. There's also a subpart B, fair price statutes. The third generation statutes are broken into waiting period business combination statutes. And that's where Amada comes from. That's part B under third gen. Other constituency and pill validation. Those are going to be the last big parts. So most states now have statutes regulating takeover bids. These statutes tend to fall into several patterns, although they're highly variable between those patterns. This note will canvass the major patterns, generally by discussing one statute within each pattern. However, it should be borne in mind that even statutes that fall into a given pattern often diverge in material respects. Furthermore, because the statutes are highly complex, only their main features will be discussed. State takeover statutes have evolved over time. Conventionally, they are categorized as first, second, and third generation statutes. Part 1, first generation statutes. The first generation statutes tended to impose very stringent requirements on takeover bids, including fairness reviews by state agencies. Moreover, generally speaking, the application of the statutes was not limited to corporations incorporated in the relevant state. In Edgar v. Mike Corp. Of 1982, the Supreme Court held one such statute, the Illinois Takeover Act, unconstitutional. 6 justices addressed the merits of the case. All 6 justices held that the Illinois Act violated the Commerce Clause in 2 ways. First, the Act unconstitutionally regulated commerce taking place across state lines because the Act applied to prevent an offeror from making an offer even to non-Illinois shareholders. Second, the Act imposed an excessive burden on interstate commerce because the Act permitted the Illinois Secretary of State to block a nationwide tender offer. 3 of the justices also held that the Illinois statute was unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause on the ground that the major objective of Williams Act, which we talked about earlier, was to maintain a neutral balance between management and the bidder, and the Illinois Act violated this balance. So part 2 is the second generation statutes. After the decision in Edgar v. Might, a number of statutes adopted second generation takeover. All right, so this Might case is unconstitutionality for strain on Commerce Clause and Supremacy Clause. So, a number of states adopted after second generation takeover statutes. These statutes fall into 2 major patterns: control share acquisition statutes and fair price statutes. For the first, control share acquisition statutes provide that if an acquiring shareholder crosses a designated threshold of stock ownership, the shareholder is prohibited from voting the acquired shares unless he obtains approval to do so by vote of a majority of the corporation's disinterested shareholders. That is, majority of the corporation's that is shareholders other than the acquirer and the corporation's management. In CTS Corp versus Dynamics Corp of America, in 1987. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Indiana's control share acquisition statute. So here's another case. That statute applied whenever a person acquired shares that, but for the operation of the statute, would bring the person's voting power in the corporation to or above 20%, 33 1/3%, or 50% of total voting power. An acquirer that crossed one of these thresholds could not vote on the acquired stock unless voting rights were approved by a majority of all disinterested shareholders voting at the next regularly scheduled meeting of the shareholders or a specially scheduled meeting. The statute was limited to target corporations incorporated in Indiana. The court concluded that the Indiana statute did not violate the Commerce Clause because it did not discriminate against interstate commerce and did not subject activities to inconsistent regulation. The statute applied only to Indiana corporations, and the state has authority to regulate domestic corporations, including the authority to define the voting rights of shareholders. The court also held that the Indiana statute was not preempted by the Williams Act. In this regard, the court contrasted the Indiana statute with the Illinois statute that was found unconstitutional in might. First, the Illinois statute provided for a 20-day pre-commencement period. During this time, management could disseminate its views on the upcoming tender offer to shareholders. So this is back to might. But bidders could not publish their offers. This conflicted with the Williams Act because Congress has deleted pre-commencement notice provisions from the Williams Act. In contrast, the Indiana statute did not give either management or the would-be acquirer an advantage in communicating with shareholders about an impending tender offer. Second, the Illinois statute provided for a review of the fairness of tender offers by the Illinois Secretary of State. This conflicted with the Williams Act because Congress intended shareholders to be free to make their own decisions. In contrast, the Indiana statute did not allow the state government to interpose its views in fairness between willing buyers and sellers of shares of the target company. Rather, the statute allowed shareholders to collectively evaluate the fairness of the offer. So that applied in might, not in dynamics. So I'll just call the Indiana case example dynamics. Dynamics also comports to Williams Act. Legislation change. Third, in this compare and contrast, the Illinois statute that was unconstitutional set no deadline for the state agency hearing on the tender offer so that management could indefinitely stymie a takeover. This conflicted with the Williams Act because Congress anticipated that bidders would be free to go forward without unreasonable delay. In contrast, the Indiana statute did not impose an infinite delay on tender offers. Nothing in the Indiana statute prohibited an offer from consummating an offer So an offeror from consummating an offer on the 20th business day, the earliest day permitted under federal law, and the full voting rights will be vested or denied within 50 days of the commencement of the tender offer. So now we're going to the second part of the second generation statutes, which is called the fair price statutes, which essentially require that if a winning bidder makes a two-tier tender offer, it must pay non-tendering shareholders the highest price it has paid for target shares within a specified recent period, typically 2 years. If, after having acquired control of the target, the bidder seeks to engage in a business combination or one of certain other defined transactions with the target, there is an exception if the transaction is approved by typically 80% of all shares and 2/3 of the shares not owned by the bidder. Third generation statutes, waiting period, business combination statutes. Waiting period of business combination statutes prohibit a corporation B who acquires more than a specific percentage of another corporation T from merging with T or engaging in certain other transactions with T for a designated waiting period unless certain conditions are satisfied. Okay, so that's actually a definition I need to know. These are all rules. I need to write these down. Puppy. Oh, he is so cute. Okay, fair price statutes is another rule to write down. So those essentially require that if the winning bidder takes a 2-day tender offer, it must pay non-tendering shareholders the highest price it has paid for the target shares within the recent specified period, typically 2 years. If after having acquired control of the target, the bidder seeks to engage in the business combination or one of the other defined transactions with the target, there is an exception if the transaction is approved by typically 80% of all shares. That is the entire sentence. Oh my God. I'm going to end it there. I don't get it. Hey. Oh my God. He's so cute. Can this rabbit be seen right now? What are you doing? What are you doing? Are you eating that branch? Stop it. You stop eating that palm branch. Bubby, you knock it off and you eat your Timothy hay like a good boy. You stop eating that. That's enough. That's enough. I know he's eating it before he's not cooking. He's sick. But stop it. Right. So, back to the third generation statutes. I just gave the definition of the waiting period of business combination statutes, which prohibit a corporation B who acquires more than a specific percentage of another from merging with the other or engaging in certain other transactions with the other for a designated waiting period unless certain conditions are satisfied. The idea is that in many cases, a prospective buyer B expects to finance a tender offer for the stock of the target T, partly by using T's assets as collateral. If B cannot expect to merge with T shortly after the tender offer succeeds, that kind of financing will be difficult or impossible to obtain. In addition, B may have various business reasons for wanting to merge with T after a tender offer, rather than running T as a partly owned subsidiary. These purposes are also frustrated by waiting period statutes. The New York statute NY Business Corp Law, Section 912, provides for a 5-year delay in effecting specified transactions, even if the transaction is not self-interested, unless the transaction is approved by T's board of directors prior to B's acquisition of the designated percentage of T stock. The less stringent Delaware statute prohibits business combinations and other designated transactions between B and T for a period of 3 years unless B acquires 85%. You know that for me? Stop it. Unless B acquires 85% of T shares in the initial tender offer or the transaction is approved by 85% of T shares other than the shares held by B. The potency of this variety of statute is acquired Okay. Back to this. The potency of this variety of statute is in discouraging hostile bids is reflected by the 94% decline in hostile bids being launched for Delaware corporations during the enactment of the Delaware Business Combination Statute. And that's in an article. That's a stat from an article in 2010. Should the total disappearance of successful hostile bids for Delaware companies following the state's enactment of Section 203 invite reconsideration whether the statute imposes an unconstitutional burden on commerce? Read the rest of the article. So another part is the Amanda case, Acquisition Corp versus Universal Foods Corp, which is from 1989 in the Seventh Circuit, which held that the Wisconsin waiting period was constitutional. So, arguments against state anti-takeover statutes based on preemption have not won easy acceptance among the justices for several reasons. First, there's Section 28A of the 34 Act. Gives a citation which provides that nothing in this chapter shall affect the jurisdiction of the Securities Commission of any state over any security or any person insofar as it does not conflict with the provisions of this chapter or the rules and regulations thereunder. The SEC has not drafted regulations concerning mergers with controlling shareholders, and the Act itself does not address this subject. The best argument for the preemption is the Williams Act neutrality between bidder and management, a balance designated to leave investors free to choose. This is not a confident jumping off point though. There is a big difference between what Congress enacts and what it supposes will ensue. Expectations about the consequences of a law are not themselves law. To say that Congress wanted to be neutral between bidder and target is not to say that it also forbade the states to favor one of these sides. Any bidder complying with the federal state is free to acquire shares of Wisconsin firms on schedule. Delaying completing a second stage merger may make the target less attractive and thus depress the price offered or even lead to the absence of bids. It does not, however, alter any of the procedures governed by federal regulation. It is not attractive under the statute to put bids on the table for Wisconsin corporations, but because Wisconsin leaves the process alone once a bidder appears, its law may coexist with the Williams Act. The Commerce Clause, Article 1, Title 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states. When state law discriminates against interstate commerce expressly, for example, when Wisconsin closes its border to butter from Minnesota, the anti-discrimination aspect of the Commerce Clause steps in. The law before us is not of this type. It is neutral between interstate and intrastate commerce. Amada therefore passes on us the broader all-weather, be reasonable vision of the Constitution. Wisconsin has passed a law that unreasonably injures investors, most of whom live outside Wisconsin, and therefore it has to be unconstitutional. As Armada sees things, Amanda? Oh my God. Sees things. However, the Supreme Court has, as Amanda sees, However, the Supreme Court has looked for discrimination rather than for baleful effects. Baleful. I don't know what baleful means. Baleful. The Commerce Clause does not demand that states leave bidders a meaningful opportunity for success. So now, other third-generation statutes, amendment, and perhaps other factors embolden some states to adopt other extremely exotic and, in some cases, draconian third-generation statutes. For example, the Pennsylvania statute provides, among many other things, that persons who own or offer to acquire publicly announce an intention to acquire 20% of the stock of a publicly traded Pennsylvania corporation must disgorge any profits they realize from the disposition of that corporation stock within a defined period. That comes from Title 15 of the Pennsylvania Constitution Statute, annotated section 2571 through 75, published by West, 1995. Ohio has a similar disgorgement provision. Yeah, we've got disgorgement provisions. Ohio, Rev Code, and whatever, who cares? The Massachusetts statute requires every public corporation to have a classified board. Wow. Okay, D is constituency statutes. A number of states have also adopted constituency statutes, which allow a board to consider the interests of groups, constituencies, other than shareholders in making decisions, including decisions to resist takeovers. These statutes give the board increased leeway to resist a takeover because often these other constituencies, for example, labor and the local community, are opposed to takeovers. Pill validation statutes, approximately one half of the statutes. I didn't actually listen to any of that. A number of statutes have also adopted constituency statutes. The definition is that those allow a board to consider the interests of groups, constituencies other than the shareholders in making decisions. We knew that. To resist takeovers. And there's increased leeway to resist a takeover because there are other constituencies. So labor and local community, for example. Pill validation statutes, approximately one half of the states have statutes that endorse the use of poison pill. Very few state anti-takeover statutes are opt-in statutes. That is, all firms incorporated in the state are subject to the state's anti-takeover provision unless specifically prescribed steps to opt out of the provision are pursued. Why would the default rule favor application of the statutory provided defense? In an extensive analysis of state takeover statutes, Professor Subramanian provides strong evidence that state anti-takeover statutes, particularly control share, waiting period, and pill validation statutes, assume a significant role in the public company's corporate domicile. Moreover, his data reflects that companies migrate away from the draconian anti-takeover provisions of Massachusetts, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Thank you. And it's giving the citation for that lovely article. These results support the view that managers migrate to and fail to migrate away from typical anti-takeover statutes that are generally acknowledged to reduce shareholder value, business combination statutes, control share acquisition statutes, and the pill validation statutes. Another impact of state anti-takeover statutes is that existence greatly influences whether the state court rejects the heightened Unicall Revlon scrutiny and instead court's defensive maneuvers the more deferential review under the business judgment rule. The article cited is Barzuza, 2009, finding Unicall duties were rejected in 11 states and following in 11, while Revlon duties were rejected in 9 states, followed in 6. The direct implication of this study is that in some states there are no enhanced fiduciary duties for change in control situations. The famous Unicall and Revlon duo taught in corporations courses and followed by academics simply does not apply to some firms. The BJR, which is a business judgment rule, and other weakened duties replace them either explicitly in state statutes or in state's case law. As a result, managers in those firms have a wide latitude to use defensive tactics, and as long as they do so, do not have direct conflict of interest and are adequately informed, they will enjoy the protection of the business judgment rule. So the only minimal requirements are to be informed, no conflict of interest. And Unical, what, is followed in 11? No. Followed in 11. Unical is followed in 11. Revlon is followed in 6. So, since the results captured in Professor Barzuz's study are linked directly to the impact of the legislature's adoption of state anti-takeover statutes, does the legislature's action necessarily support the court's conclusion that management-initiated defensive maneuvers that are not covered by the state anti-takeover statute should nonetheless similarly be removed from heightened scrutiny? An interesting question is, what impact does the state anti-takeover statute have on managers? The empirical evidence focused on this question suggested some positive features of state anti-takeover statutes. Firms incorporated in states providing second-generation anti-takeover statutes are less highly leveraged than firms without such protection from takeovers. And there's a citation for that quote. Such firms also engage in greater capital expenditures in research and development than firms not enjoying the protection of state anti-takeover statutes. So read that back. Anti-takeover statutes encourage development. Wow. Thank you. So it's not just me being draconian. There's higher expenditures in research and development. Okay, period. Why? Because people that build organizations deserve to be able to keep them or control them without shareholders running away with it. On the negative side, though, there is some evidence that pay is more poorly linked to performance when firms have both specific anti-takeover defenses, i.e. poison pill, as well as state anti-takeover statute, than when firms have only firm-specific anti-takeover defenses. And there's a citation for that article, and that's the end of the chapter. So the only thing left to do is read the Omnicare case. And that concludes corporate combination center offers and defending control, chapter 14.